All right, so in this section, we're combining supply and demand and the concepts of elasticity. So previously, we've drawn shifts in demand and supply and studied the changes in equilibrium price and quantity. We want to know how will the magnitude of the price and quantity changes be affected if we alter these elasticities. Okay. So let's look at this here. So we've got a shift in demand, right? An increase in demand. What's the difference in the change in equilibrium going to be if we look at two different supply curves, right? So we've got a short-run supply curve. So recall that in the short run, supply is less elastic, so it's going to be closer to vertical. And in the long run, supply is going to be more elastic, so it's going to be flatter. Okay, so we've got we've got a less elastic supply and a more elastic supply. And so we want to think about how the changes in equilibrium are going to change, right? We've got the same shift in demand in both cases. How is the elasticity of supply going to affect the responsiveness in terms of the change in equilibrium? So focusing on the short-run supply curve, we see that given the increase in demand from D1 to D2, there's a relatively small increase in quantity, in equilibrium quantity, from Q1 to Q2. And in addition to that, there's a relatively large increase in price from $60 to $90. Now let's compare that to when supply is more elastic, right? If supply is more elastic, like the long-run supply curve there that we see that the same increase in demand will increase quantity to a larger extent. So rather than going from Q1 to Q2, like in the short run, we go from Q1 to Q3. So the quantity response is bigger when the supply curve is more elastic. We also see that the price response is smaller. So instead of going from $60 to $90 with the short run supply curve, we only go from $60 up to $80 in the long run. Okay, so there you go. There's looking at how elasticity can affect changes in equilibrium. All right, so we're going to wrap up this chapter with a pretty interesting policy example. Okay, so here's a good question for you. How should we, if we were the government, decrease illegal drug use, or maybe as a society? Maybe it's not even the government, but as a society or as the government, how should we decrease illegal drug use? Okay, so to start thinking about this, do you think that the demand for illegal drugs is relatively elastic or inelastic, and why? So if you need to, pause the video and think about this for a second. All right, so hopefully after thinking about it for a minute, you realize that the demand for illegal drugs is probably relatively inelastic, and that's for maybe a few reasons. There are usually relatively few or even no substitutes for most illegal drugs. So that's one reason, few or no substitutes. Another reason is that they usually take up a small percentage of income. So that's something that means inelastic, would make it inelastic. Something else is the fact that many illegal drugs are addictive, right? Which more or less makes them a necessity for the drug addict, right? So there's an increased willingness to pay. There's a decrease in the elasticity for addictive drugs. And then on top of that, there could be short run versus long run, or there could be time aspects with regard to this as well. But in any case, it's most likely that the demand for illegal drugs is relatively inelastic. All right, so knowing that, suppose that we wanted to enact a policy with the following goals. We want to greatly decrease drug consumption, so we want to really decrease the quantity of drugs sold in a market. In other words, we really want to decrease the equilibrium quantity. And at the same time, we want to make drug dealing as unattractive as possible for drug dealers, right? We want to make it less attractive business so that we discourage people from getting into drug dealing. So what should we try to do if those are our goals? Should we try to decrease the supply of drugs, or should we try to decrease the demand for drugs? So go ahead and pause the video, take a couple minutes to think about this. Maybe draw a picture, right? Knowing that demand is inelastic, so it's relatively, it's pretty close to vertical. Take a couple minutes and think about this, draw a picture, draw a graph, and try to come up with an answer. All right, so let's start off by thinking about what would happen if we targeted supply. We tried to decrease supply. Well, because demand is relatively inelastic, we would have only a very small decrease in quantity, right? So there'd only be a very small decrease in drug transactions. On top of that, there'd be a very large, a relatively large, I should say, increase in price. And recall back to how elasticity of demand relates to revenues, right? This basically would increase drug revenues, right? Making dealing drugs more attractive. So if we're targeting supply, trying to decrease supply of drugs, we wouldn't achieve either of our goals. We wouldn't decrease quantity very much, and we would actually make drug dealing more attractive and more lucrative, and potentially even more dangerous because of the money involved. So clearly targeting the drug supply is probably not the best policy action. In fact, this is why the war on drugs has failed for so long. All through the late 80s and into the 90s and even the early 2000s, the war on drugs to a large degree targeted the supply of drugs. And it only ended up increasing the profitability of drug dealing, and it didn't have much of an impact on the quantity of drugs purchased. And so, not really a good policy measure. Now, if instead we targeted demand, tried to decrease demand, we would actually achieve both of our goals. There would be a large decrease in the number of drugs transacted in the market. There would be a large decrease in the prices of drugs, which at first seems counterintuitive, right? Oh, well, we don't want these drugs to be cheaper because that means more people would use them. Well, the decrease in price is coming from the decrease in demand, right? So actually, that's not the case. Price would come down because demand went down, right? And because both price and quantity go down, the money that drug dealers would make goes down as well. So now drug dealing is less attractive. So as it turns out, targeting the demand side of illegal drugs is probably the best way about trying to achieve our two goals, our two policy goals. Right. So again, if we want to accomplish our two goals, the best policy is decreasing the demand for drugs. It's much better than trying to decrease the supply of drugs. And it's better to use our resources on education and offering legal substitutes rather than increasing penalties and police enforcement. Right. So the education and the increase in legal substitutes would help decrease demand for the illegal drugs. Now, of course, another policy is to simply legalize them, right? Marijuana, for example, honestly should just be legal. It has far fewer negative effects than even alcohol. You can't get addicted to marijuana. You can't overdose on marijuana. People are less violent when they smoke marijuana. So maybe instead of decreasing demand, maybe just legalize it if it's something like marijuana. Drugs like heroin, cocaine, on the other hand, a lot of negative effects of those drugs. So we probably want to try to do things, educate people, offer legal substitutes, healthier substitutes. And in fact, maybe legalizing marijuana would be one of those substitutes, right? So interesting things to think about. If you're interested, research Spain and their harm reduction policies with regards to drugs. Really interesting drug policies over there in Spain. Or maybe it's Portugal. I can't remember which one it is. Might be Portugal. In any case, Google it. You might have some few hours of interesting research there. All right, so that concludes chapter 4, which has gone over elasticity. Make sure you get lots of practice using that midpoint method. Make sure you practice memorizing, when the signs of these things matter. They only matter for income elasticity and cross-price elasticity. Otherwise, we can basically ignore the sign for price elasticity of supply and price elasticity of demand. Only the magnitudes for those two matter. But I would spend lots of time practicing the midpoint method because that is something that's probably new to most of you, and it can be a challenge calculating these measures. So make sure you get lots of practice. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me through iCollege. I'll be happy to respond as quickly as I can to your questions. In any case, I hope you guys have a good week. Hope you do well on your homeworks and quizzes. I will see you in the next video for chapter 5.